Direction Point! Direction Point!
A Doctor Who podcast network.
Well, hi, everybody. Welcome back to Doctor Who Literature, the podcast taking you through the world of the Doctor Who novelizations put out by Target Books from 1973 onward in publication order. We're a member of the Direction Point Doctor Who podcast network. My name is Jason, and I'm your host on this journey, this very long journey. Chartable tells me this week that I've achieved two of my highest rankings ever. This week I am number 21 among science fiction podcasts in Great Britain and number 21 among science fiction podcasts in Australia. That's about as well as I've ever done, so it's good to know that I'm bubbling under the top 20. Keep on listening, guys, and maybe I'll make the top 10. Thank you very much to all of you who have been joining me for this journey along the way. We are at book 60 this week, the 60th book put out by Target. This came out in August 1980. It was the second of two August 1980 books. Keys of Marinus we discussed last week on episode 59. This month, by the way, is the 50th anniversary of the first Target novelizations, which were, of course, the reprints of the three Frederick Muller books, Doctor Who in an Exciting Adventure with the Daleks, Doctor Who and the Crusaders, and Doctor Who and the Zarbi. Those were released in Target editions in January 1973, exactly 50 years ago. And we have some other exciting news to break this week. We are getting 5 new Target novelizations under the revived Target imprint, and those are all going to be coming out in July 2023, just about 6 months away. That is going to be Kerblam by Pete McTighe. That is the 13th Doctor story. Planet of the Ood by Keith Temple, a 10th Doctor story. The Zygon Invasion by Peter Harness. That's going to be a novelization of the two-parter, the Zygon Invasion and the Zygon Inversion, starring the 12th Doctor. Waters of Mars by Phil Ford. That is a 10th Doctor special from the 2009 season. And Warrior's Gate by Stephen Gallagher. Now, John Lydecker, Stephen Gallagher's pen name, had put out a novelization of the War Games. We're coming up to that pretty soon on this show. But what this is going to be is the novelization of the audiobook release, which came out about 4 or 5 years ago, performed by the great John Culshaw. This is going to be the original manuscript that Stephen Gallagher submitted based upon his original scripts. There's a lot of significant changes from the story as televised, which had input from director Paul Joyce and script editor Christopher H. Bigmead. So you're going to be getting basically the original version of the story that Gallagher sold and not the novelization of the story as televised. It means we're going to have 2 novelizations of Warrior's Gate, 2 different versions of the story, both written by the same person, but each spine will bear a different name. The pseudonym John Lydecker versus the original author's name, Stephen Gallagher. I have listened to the John Culshaw audio. I'm very much a printed page guy, so I am looking forward to the paperback edition of that as well. So turning ahead to this week, this is the last novelization of a Bob Baker Doctor Who script, the last of 9. Pete Lambert is rejoining us this week for the 4th time. We're going to have a terrific conversation. Now, the first 20 minutes are not talking about Doctor Who at all. We get into a pretty deep discussion of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, its spin-off TV series Angel, how this may have influenced Russell T Davies and Torchwood, and we're also going to have a long talk about one of my favorite American shows, House MD, which is a medical mystery version of Sherlock Holmes and starring Hugh Laurie as the title character. That's what's really great about the Target novelizations. I mean, The Nightmare of Eden is not a perfect episode on TV for reasons that Pete and I are going to get into. And while Terrance Dicks does a fine job here, as I will get into at the back of the program when I do my audio essay, even a less than perfect episode or a less than perfect book can still lead to a terrific chat. Not every novelization can be Doctor Who and the Crusaders, or Doctor Who Legopolis, or Doctor Who Remembrance of the Daleks. Even a middle tier book or a lower tier TV story like this one can still be great fun for discussion, and that's why we're all still here in this 50th anniversary month of the Target line. Happy birthday, Doctor Who Novelizations. Let's get to it.
Are you ready to travel through time with us? Then check out Traveling the Vortex, a Doctor Who podcast. For nearly 7 years and more than 500 episodes, we've traveled from one end of the vortex to the other, making different stops with different doctors, reviewing everything from TV stories to audio plays, from books to comics, and more. Sean, Keith, and Glenn take you on a journey through 50 plus years of Doctor Who episodes and spin-off materials. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts, so be sure to check us out. And now, we're a proud member of Direction Point, a Doctor Who podcast network. You're listening to the Doctor Who Literature Podcast.
So, Pete, welcome back. Every time I turn on Twitter these days, it seems like you're guesting on another podcast. So, in the month since we've last spoken, what else have you been up to?
Well, it's all the synchronicity of it all is a bit. It's quite strange. So the Maximum Power, the Blake Seven podcast that I very much enjoy contributing to, is currently approaching the climax of the second series of Blake Seven. Our reviews of that, but we recorded those almost a year ago. And then I've also done a special little thing with Joe for Hamster Extra, talking about Buffy the Vampire Slayer, which we discovered was a mutual love of ours that we hadn't realised. So it's great when a penny like that drops, because when you just obsessively talk about Doctor Who with somebody, it's easy to forget that you might actually like other stuff too. So yeah, I've been gadding about.
I would like to say that I was there with Buffy from the very beginning, but I was not, because the first episode premiered in the States March 1997.
Mm.
And I was in my second year of law school, and I had a lot of free time, so I was watching a lot more television back then than I was now. But opposite Buffy, on one of the other networks, was this TV series called Spy Game, which was meant to be an homage to all these 1960s espionage TV shows.
Yeah.
And that first episode had cameos, I think, from Robert Culp, who had been in I Spy, and Patrick McNee, obviously, from the Avengers. And the female lead in that series had been my very first Broadway show was Annie back like in 1980. And the person
Yeah.
who was the female lead in Spy Game had been Little Orphan Annie on stage when I saw that, my first Broadway show at age 7 or so. So I chose Spy Game over Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and I can tell you that nobody 25 years later is doing podcasts about Spy Game. I mean, it was a decent episode, kind of pedestrian. The following week, I turned on the second episode of Buffy. Well, I guess the third episode now, because the first episode has been split up in two. But The
Yeah.
Witch. And that was, it was okay. It wasn't really until the season 2 premiere that I really got into Buffy as a great show. But I was a regular watcher, for semi-regular from the very beginning.
Yeah, I remember. Well, I caught the first episode when it first got onto BBC. So it was like 18 months or so after America, and it had been on satellite here first. But I just immediately sat there thinking that this is a rip off of Doctor Who. This is you've got this this bookish British guy with his sassy young female kick-ass. It was just obviously based on Ace, and it's funny how you can sort of imprint. And I think there was maybe a little bit of that in there, but I don't think it was entirely that Joss Whedon sat down and decided to try and let's take Remembrance of the Daleks and turn it into a series. There's a bit more to it than that. Remembrance of the Daleks, except vampires. That's it. That's Buffy in one sentence.
I had seen the Buffy movie, which came out like about 5 years earlier, and I didn't see that in the theater. Nobody saw that in the theater, but I watched it on HBO, and that had a all-star cast. Christy Swanson was a big deal in the early '90s. Donald Sutherland was always a big deal. Pee Wee Herman, the actor who played Pee Wee Herman, had a part as a vampire minion. It was not, and it also had Luke Perry, who was a big deal at the time because of Beverly Hills 90210. But I watched about half of that, got bored, turned away. The TV series was much better because Joss Whedon had more creative control over the series, and that, of course, ran for 7 years. So, what did you bring up as your favorite points about Buffy on the other podcast?
Ooh, well, I loved how it blended emotion and humor and horror, and it. I love the way that you can always see with like with a lot of the best genre things, you can see that the characters kind of know the ridiculousness of the situation that they're in, but they don't front load it. There's just in the same way that Servalan in Blake Seven always has this air of being sort of put upon, and occasionally she'll just roll her eyes and be like, "Oh, what have I got to do now? I suppose I've got to go about being evil again." And you get a lot of that from the vampires in Buffy, and of course from Buffy herself. They're all so there's that thing of the characters' internal monologues are sort of visible, and I think that's a really clever, an amazingly difficult thing to achieve. And you've got to have a perfect cast and an incredible script to do it. And they just kept doing it with Buffy. It amazes me.
So, for you, what was the episode that turned Buffy from a good show, which it was from the beginning, to a great show? And then I'll tell you my answer after I've heard yours.
Okay, yeah. Um, I did. I really liked the climax of series one. The way that it all linked in, and just the idea of having a one series long season arc. But it was the Halloween episode, Halloween in series two, which is a very light-hearted episode. But it's that trope of having the episode where everyone's not being themselves, through which you get to learn more about who they really are. And I just thought I really like these people. Even I'm enjoying the ones that aren't meant to be likable. I want to see all the rest of the show. And it's funny because that's a kind of comic aside episode almost, but like all of the funny Buffy episodes, there's big hitting things that happen in it that actually have real consequences throughout the story. So it's not a colossal episode, but yeah, that was one that just made me think I want to see every episode of this now. What was yours?
I'm similar to you. I remember, this is embarrassing. I remember watching the season one finale of Buffy, and I would have watched that the day that it first aired, so about June 1997. When Mark Metcalf's character was written out of the series at the end of season one, I thought, wait a minute, they've just gotten rid of their big bad. What are they going to do for season two? It
Yes,
shows you how little faith I had in Joss Whedon at that time, and of course how little faith I have in him now for all sorts of other
different
reasons.
reasons. Yes, yes. It's good at the writing.
Season two of Buffy premieres. This is September of 1997, and I'm in my last year of law school. And I really wanted to watch the season premiere, but I had pre existing plans with my then girlfriend, who was not yet a Buffy fan. She would become one later. So I missed the episode, and it turns out that was a great episode, but I missed it in the moment. The second episode of season two was, monster of the week, kind of silly. Watched it, went in one eye and out the other.
Hmm.
Episode three, School Hard, which introduces Spike and Drew. That was the moment for me when this show went from okay to amazing, and from that point on, I never voluntarily missed another episode. And season two just gets better and better because then Oz shows up, and then you have that two-parter in the middle, Surprise slash Innocence, which really just puts the series in high gear. And then the two-part season finale. That's when I started taping the show regularly on VHS, and from that point on, I had every episode on VHS up until the very end of the line of season seven.
Yeah, I had a very confusing period where the BBC was showing it quite late. You could, but I loved it so much. I think BBC was still just at the start of season two. Sky was just started on season three, so I rushed out and subscribed to Sky. So I was watching season two and season three simultaneously, which is very strange when you think about what happens to the in the arcs, particularly around Angel.
Huh.
In that, I saw how that arc was dealt with after it had finished before I even got to the middle of it. So it was quite strange. But still, I just wanted all of it in whatever order I could get it. At some point, I was hiring VHS tapes from a video rental shop as well, from Blockbuster, with like 3 episodes per tape.
Oh wow! I recently got rid of all my Buffy DVDs, which I was sad to do, but I'm not going to watch them again. I tried to introduce my 12-year-old to the show, but it doesn't have the same meaning for her because she's watching a lot more contemporary television, which really
Yeah.
disappointed me because I was looking forward to watching the entire series with her. But things age and date.
Yeah, it's and it was such a timely show. It had that putting that late '90s sensibility onto characters who we know have grown up just watching '70s vampire movies being rerun. That's their knowledge of vampires and zombies and such, which we would all have too at that age. And having that postmodern thing of characters using it as their own terms of reference was just so fresh and you can't reburst that bubble twice culturally, can you? But it's still, yeah, I don't know how it works viewed out of that context.
And it also doesn't help that most of the cast have not gone on to bigger and better things, with the exception of Allison Hannigan, who is now, of course, thanks to How I Met Your Mother, she's probably more famous for that now than she is
Oh
for
yeah,
Buffy.
yeah,
But a
yeah.
lot of the other actors in the show have not gone on to super long careers.
No, although one thing I loved, I'm just remembering another thing I loved about it when I started watching it was I think I was moving out of my mid 20s, and feeling like I was so old, and all fun days were behind me, and seeing this show where I checked and two of the lead cast, both Charisma Carpenter and Nicholas Brandon, are slightly older than me, and they were still getting away with playing 17-year-olds. So I thought there's hope for us all to still be a little bit juvenile, even at my advanced age of 26 or whatever I was.
I think I am now older than Anthony Stewart Head was when he was cast as Giles, so
In season one, he looks so baby faced now, whereas at the time, watching it at the time, he was this, stuffy guy from a British museum or the British Museum. I mean, that sort of line is just what puts it. Anyway, sorry, I could wax lyrical all night.
oh, so could I. And with Buffy having a musical episode, we could wax over the lyrics because I'm pretty sure I have every line to every one of those songs memorized.
Yeah, and almost every single one advances the plot or reveals something about a character at the same time as being a funny lyric and a funny rhyme. It's inconceivable that they would just churn that out. Of course, they didn't, but it appeared to, the churning out 22 episodes a year. Of course, not in a healthy and wholesome working environment is probably the answer, but still, the end product, not even
Considering how
close.
Charisma Carpenter was written out of the series.
Yeah,
Before we
yeah,
move
yeah.
on to the topic of the week, I
Oh
should
yeah, sorry.
amend. I should amend that David Boreanaz, as soon as Buffy and Angel wrapped, he immediately went on to Bones, which ran for 8 years, which is longer than Buffy or Angel ever did. And that ended up being, the show that he is probably most known for now, because he was one of the co-leads on that, and it ran for a very long time.
Oh,
But he
right, I never
was
saw
playing
that.
a straight-laced FBI agent rather than playing a tortured vampire. So very different acting skills. And then, of course, Seth Green has never, ever stopped working, and he is legitimately
Yeah.
hilarious. But both of them left Buffy after season 3. So two of the best or known performers in the
Mm.
cast weren't even there for half the series.
Yeah, yeah. I don't know if there's a lesson in that about jumping before the series has run its course, if you want. But yeah, I'm glad that none of the other leads did though.
Seth Green had wanted to do other things, and
Hmm.
David Boreanaz went straight from Buffy to Angel to Bone. So he had about a 15 or 20-year period where he never stopped working as a series headliner.
Hmm.
That's a pretty good career to have.
Yeah, yeah. James Masters deserves all the credit for, I think, doing the best American doing a British accent that's ever been committed to moving pictures of any format. It's just his voice has spiked. I still, if I see interviews with him now talking, and he's Texan, isn't he, or it's a Southern accent? Yeah, and he just sounds like he's putting on a voice. I just can't believe that he's not that Spike's voice isn't his real accent. And there's very few actors who ever really. I suppose Hugh Laurie's done the same in reverse, hasn't he? Recently, by I've heard Americans say that his accent is so good that it seems implausible to them when they hear him putting on a British voice. I don't know if that's your take on it too.
I didn't really know who Hugh Laurie was when House MD started, because that started in 2004, and I was a
Hmm.
much bigger baseball fan back then than I am now. And Fox, the American network, was promoting the heck out of House MD during the playoffs and World Series. So during every
Uh,
commercial break, there was the same promo for House airing over and over again. And I'm like, I don't recognize that actor. Who is that?
Yeah.
And then I knew the name Hugh Laurie from following Doctor Who fandom. I knew about Fry and Laurie, but I hadn't watched Blackadder, and I hadn't really seen him in
Right.
anything else. Being an American, I have a very different
Hmm.
television frame of reference than a lot of my guests on this show. So I didn't realize until a good portion of the way through season 1 of House that he was in fact not American, and I was
He got away with
completely
it.
fooled.
Yeah. Yeah. Speaking of accents, I could suddenly, suddenly the Nightmare of Eden has popped into my head for some reason, but not the book. We're supposed to be talking about the
Oh,
book.
we will come to that very, very shortly.
We'll get there. We'll get there. Sorry, I didn't mean to derail you, but I couldn't stop myself laughing when I realised what we were talking about.
There is an episode of House MD where House has to call London and tries to fake the world's worst British accent. And we were
Oh,
sitting there
lovely.
laughing, and then you realize, wait a minute, he is British, and he's
Yeah,
faking an American doing a bad British accent. That has all sorts of
yeah.
layers of incredible.
Yeah. Oh, and of course Daphne and Fraser, who is British but is not from anywhere near Manchester and really doesn't sound like it to anyone who knows Manchester, who's ever been to the north of England. But but then the increasing ridiculousness of meeting all of her siblings and them all having atrociously bad accents from all corners of these islands, which I think I'm sure was a deliberate joke.
James Marsters is from California, as it turns out, and he's
Oh, is he?
60
Oh,
now, by
right.
the way. Thank you for that. Now I feel really old.
60? God. Yeah,
But
that's a
the
tough line.
smart thing that he did, he was when most Americans think British accents, they think either RP or Cockney, and he did neither one.
Mm.
So it was a British
Mm.
accent that most Americans were not familiar with, and that ended up being very, very clever.
Yeah, yeah.
So to bring this back to Doctor Who, finally, after at least 15 minutes, my favorite anecdote about James Marsters is he writes to Russell T Davies because he's watching Doctor Who Series 1 in 2005 and says, "This is a great show, I've got to get on it." And he writes to Russell T Davies and says, "I want to be on Doctor Who." And RTD goes, "Wait a minute, I've got a much better show for you to be on, and we're going to put your talents to the full use." And that's how he wound up as Captain Jack's boyfriend on Torchwood.
It's a small world.
And we can thank Doctor Who for that. So that's James
Yeah,
Marsters' contributions to the Doctor Who universe, even if it was only 2 episodes and a small cameo in a third.
yeah, a little bit underused, but hey. But then, but the whole, I mean, Torchwood owing a lot to Angel, the idea of taking is a at least in terms of getting it off the notion of creating it the way that they did. I think take your side character and put him in it. Well, Angel was already in a long cape, wasn't he? But I think they tried to Angel up Captain Jack to make him the lead of Torchwood, didn't they?
Yeah, he was the tortured immortal, and he was put on a spin-off that was consciously more adult and serious than the parent show. That's a
Yeah.
really good analogy, actually. I hadn't even thought of that, but yeah, that's exactly what it was.
It is, isn't it? Yeah, it's. Well, I think you could see what the template. That's what I was looking for.
So I suppose it's time we get on to talking about this week's book, which is, of course, The Nightmare of Eden. You and I were comparing copies before we started recording. I have a third edition published in 1983 with an asterisk. Do you, I believe, have the first edition?
I do, yeah. It's the 1980 edition now. But although I wouldn't have bought it then because my first target, as we discussed quite a few episodes ago, was Carnival of Monsters, which I was inspired to get having seen it in and the repeats that they did at the end of 81. So I would have got this around. It would have been 82 by the time I got to this. I can say it wasn't one of my very first ones because I've numbered it. It's number 30 in my Doctor Who collection. So there's an additional numbering system on top of the target peculiar A to Z numbers that they imposed at the point at which they then started doing them sequentially. I've got my own numbering system for the ones that I actually bought myself. But yeah, 1980, 85 pence. It's the 19, so it must have sat on a shelf for 2 or 3 years before I got my hands on it.
The 1983 printing is £1.35. So inflation has certainly taken its toll in the intervening 3 years. And my copy has the number 45 on the spine. Does yours have a
right.
spine number? Probably not.
No, it doesn't. Yeah, no, mine's pre-spine numbers. They came in the early 80s, didn't they? And then they A to Z'd all the ones that had already come out and started numbering the new releases from that point onwards. Yeah, in fact, I was just looking at that at the Target Bible, the On Target book, to see if there's any info about. And it doesn't really mention; it just breezes over Nightmare of Eden. But it does mention there's an interview with the guy who was the what's the range editor at the no, he wasn't the range editor. He was someone at WH Allen who worked with the range editor. Anyway, but he said that they pushed to put the prices up because they said they were barely making any money at 85p, or they could have made a lot more money. And they were certain that putting up the price higher than the rate of inflation wouldn't affect their sales, and they were proved right because they did this fairly abrupt price escalation over the course of about 2 years, and it didn't knock the sales down because yes, people like me were prepared to splash out more than a whole pound on a Target book, and a pound would not now buy you a chocolate bar. Well, it would buy it, but yeah, you'd struggle. You have to shop around to get a nice chocolate bar for a pound now. But yeah, amazing that you could buy it with pennies alone back then.
One more peculiarity about my copy is my copy, even though it's the third edition, it says a Target book published in 1978, which is, of course, an impossibility, or as William Hartnell would say, an impossibicity, because Nightmare of Eden hadn't even been produced and filmed and aired in 1978. So either they grabbed the page from the wrong book when they were putting this together, or somebody made a typo with the
Yeah.
printers.
I do wonder. Yeah, I wonder what the book immediately prior to that one in the reprinting schedule was. And I suspect there's a good chance it was a book that actually was from 1978, and they just copied the details page. It's interesting that yours has a price for America on it because mine doesn't. Mine has a different range of territories on it. I don't know if it can focus on that.
Yeah, you have Canada, Australia, and Malta. America didn't start getting the books until about 1983. You see, this is one of the first books that has the Lyle Stewart Incorporated mark on the back for the
Oh
American
yeah.
distribution. Now,
Oh, right.
Secaucus, New Jersey is right across the river from me. It's a suburb of New York City. But Lyle Stewart, very interesting guy, by the way. Look up Lyle Stewart's biography. He's a pretty fascinating figure in American pop culture for that particular era.
Yeah.
He had been involved with EC Comics, the notorious comic book publisher that got the United States Senate to crack down on comic books. So he peddled outrageous and controversial material. So Doctor Who was a little bit of fluff for him, but I'm sure he made a lot
Yeah.
of money distributing it in the States because those books sold like hotcakes over here for a very, very long time. And it's about 1983 when the American price starts getting put on the back cover. And I'm sure once we get to the 1984, the Peter Davison era books, you'll start seeing the U.S. price on your copies.
Right. Yeah. Yes. I bet I will. Yeah.
So let's talk about the elephant in the room. Let's talk about Nightmare of Eden on television. Is Nightmare of Eden a good story?
It's not one of the best. It's, in my opinion, it tries to do something a bit different, and just going into this. I mean, having the Doctor wandering around talking about drugs and drug smuggling is a very odd leap for them to have made. Which, I mean, people would be watching in ordinary crime TV shows that would be on in similar time slots. I don't know, maybe not actually, because Doctor Who was on much earlier than things like Sweeney. So it's one of those things that sounds very adult, but then the look and the whole style of it is so Blake Seven, Space 1999, late 70s, low budget, that it doesn't feel. It's not at all a gritty episode of Doctor Who. Yeah. What do you? And for me, it exists in a sort of hazy world where I'm not sure whether I saw it on TV or not. I wasn't regularly watching Doctor Who at that point. I know I saw bits of Destiny of the Daleks, I remember, but that's my only clear memory of that season. But something inspired me to get the book. And the one thing about this book that really has always made it stand out to me is how much the cover terrified me as what was I, 9? Reading the book and discovering that it's about these monsters that can emerge from pictures to devour you. Every night when I'd finished, I was reading it a couple of chapters a night. I didn't read a lot, but I'd read a couple of chapters a night while I was in bed, and every night I had to flip it over and put it face down on my little bedside table, because just in case the mandrill came creeping out. And I don't know whether I'd actually seen the episodes. When I finally got to see it, it looked so familiar to me, but I think that might have just been a combination of knowledge of the book and pictures I'd seen in magazines and things. So yeah, it exists in a bit of a hazy world for me of almost memorable as a TV show, but I don't think that's real. When did you first see it? Would you have seen it when it went out, or close to when it went out?
This would have come to my PBS station in August of '85, so I would have been almost 12 when I saw it. And I'd already read the book at that point for reasons that I'll get into in my review, which is coming up after this conversation. I don't really remember what I thought of the story when I first saw it, because at that point, I'm still a young viewer. I don't know anything about UK culture. I would not have been aware that this was made in the middle of a recession. I would not have been aware that it was made under severe budget cuts by a producer who did not quite have the fiscal savvy of a Barry Letts or a Philip Hinchcliffe, who were able to take small budgets and make feature film quality recordings. Graham Williams is doing the best he can, but between his acumen and the budget, it's just not there to give Bob Baker what Bob Baker wants in the script.
Yeah.
I would have very much enjoyed the over-the-top performance by one particular member of the guest cast, and the Mandrills would not have made much of an impression on me. And as much as I was infatuated with Lalla Ward, even at a fairly young age, this is not her best costume, because at that age I was rating episodes by what the companion wore. So this was not my favorite companion costume.
No, it's a very strange costume. I've heard people say that was fashionable in 1979 briefly, but I don't know.
And I wouldn't have been able to get over the fact that K9 had a different voice, because at this point I'm already very used to John Leeson. So David Brierly's only in 3 episodes that air in the States, because obviously Shada didn't make it over here until the 90s. So he would have felt like an imposter. And the Mandrills are not the most convincing monsters, even to an 11-year-old. So I would have seen it, and I already had read the novelization first. But then season 18 comes along the following month, and then all of a sudden I'm seeing Leisure Hive, and I'm seeing Full Circle, and I'm seeing State of Decay, and Warrior's Gate, and Keeper of Traken, and Logopolis. You'll notice I mentioned 6 of the 7 stories from season 18. And you can gather what I feel about the story that I didn't mention from the fact that I didn't mention it. But
It's a
all
loss.
6 of those
They make
stories
lots.
are in Doctor Who's, top 50 at least, if not all
Yeah,
higher.
sure.
So once you get through season 18, Nightmare of Eden becomes a pretty distant memory. I then watched it again when RTD announced the revival. I said, great, there's going to be a new Doctor Who. I have this aging collection of VHS tapes, so they're getting older and older. I got it into my head that I was going to watch every episode of Doctor Who one more time and then retire it and never watch it again. And of course, how foolish that turned out to be.
That's a really big version of that. I'm just going to have one more cigarette and then I'll quit.
It was probably one of the stupidest things that I've ever vowed to myself, that's for sure. But I would watch each episode one time, and I would keep a running quote list of the great quotes. Now, that's hard to do. You need a lot of time to go back and rewind the tape to get the best quotes. So I never finished that project. But I wrote a review of Nightmare of Eden for Stacey Smith's The Ratings Guide. That was a very frequent contributor to it back then. And if you look at my review of Nightmare of Eden on the Ratings Guide, and that is now, almost 20 years old, I was rather dismissive of the story, but I said there's good things about it. It's just buried in a blizzard of bad production choices. So Louis Fiander, he reads a script. He sees a gutty, gritty police procedural about drugs, and there's a tragedy of all the passengers on this luxury cruise liner getting killed off, and you
Carnage.
have the
Yeah.
tragedy of Captain Rig, which I want to come back and talk about. in the middle of all that, why does he choose to put on Kermit the Frog voice in the most bizarre, affected German accent, because he was not German, he was Australian? And secondly, we know that Alan Bromley was a problematic director who gets fired in the middle of production.
Mm.
How was he allowed to get away with this? Who thought that was a good idea?
Mm. Yeah, there are just so many choices made, and like, did they want it to be? It could be funnier and it could be scarier. Because the sequence. I remember being a friend showing when I was a teenager. Actually, in my late teens, someone showing me on VHS just the clip of the passengers all being attacked by the mandrills, as a just hilarious camp nonsense. And I just saw that sort of out of context, and was like, oh yeah, I did. I used to like Doctor Who when I was younger. And it's almost like it could be done as an all-out fuss, but then, I mean, right next to it, of course, you've got the Horns of Nimon, which is being done as an all-out fuss. And yeah, because the thing about Nightmare of Eden is, I watch it and I mean, the mandrills, bless them, as they flollop about. Sorry, we're going to talk about the book, obviously, but as they flollop about on screen, it's very endearing. But they are men in monster suits going rah in a way that, like, the Cybermen in the moon base are so much scarier than that. What That's the thing to compare it with, or why is Doctor Who being less good at being scary now, this in '79, than it was 15 or whatever years earlier? Is just yeah. But then it has moments, the creepy, very creepy moments in the going into through the I keep wanting to call it the miniscope, but that's another story. But it's basically the same. There's a thought. How would John Pertwee and Joe Grant have handled it if they discovered that Vorg and Shrina were smuggling Vraxo in the miniscope? I just can't quite. It just wouldn't go, would it? And yet the Fourth Doctor takes it in his stride, I suppose, with his Bohemian. And obviously, we come back to it with Caves of Androzani as a theme. But I think only those 2 times. That's the only 2 times we've done narcotics in Doctor Who. I'm thinking, am I forgetting something else?
I don't know if I would call Spectrox a narcotic. That was basically the elixir of life, the fountain of youth.
True. Yeah. Well, it's more metaphorical, but smuggling. Yeah, it's the smuggling aspect. I suppose there was the smugglers, of course, but they weren't smuggling. Well, I haven't seen it. I can't remember now. No, they're not smuggling dope, are they? William Hartnell isn't trying to down in Cornwall. I think they were just.
You are opening up a whole kettle of fish here, Pete.
No. Yeah, I think it was just a little bit of cider without the.
William Hartnell warning about the danger of LSD in 1966. I mean, there's a lot of fanfic you could launch right here.
Yeah. Maybe there's a reimagining to be done.
Season 17, when I got to Rec Arts Doctor Who in the early 90s, and that was the town square for Doctor Who fandom in the 90s. But season 17 on Rec Arts Doctor Who, with the exception of City of Death, that season was derided and unloved by most of the regulars on RADW because Creature from the Nightmare of Nimon, which is how that season was referred to, it's 3 very silly, very cheap-looking stories. So if you were to go back in time and ask me 30 years ago what I thought of season 17, I would have said it's all garbage. Now, of course, we have a more enlightened perspective. Everything about classic Doctor Who is now dated. Even the best story looks dated. So you can no longer say, well, this story is good because it has good effects and good props, and this story is bad because it has bad effects and bad props. They're all bad. So now that we're no longer watching Doctor Who as an active current series, now that we're watching it as archival, and now that we are adjusting in our heads for the limits of production, when you watch it that way, Creature from the Pit is wonderful. It's a very, very, very funny and witty script. That novelization's coming up in 2 or 3 weeks on this show, so we'll talk about it a little more. Horns of Nymon is an absolute delight, and it is one of my comfort stories that I can watch over and over again and never get sick of it. And that's coming up on next week's show, so we'll talk about that. City of Death is one of my all-time favorites. Destiny of the Daleks, we've already talked about that because that was the first season 17 book to be novelized, right? And I'm very fond of Destiny of the Daleks. I think it's very, very underrated, and I think it's derided for all the wrong reasons. And yes, David Gooderson, if you line up all the Davros actors in a row, he gives the weakest performance out of them all, including Julian Bleach. But I think Destiny is underrated. So that means that Nightmare of Eden for me is probably the weakest surviving story of the season. And probably not even quite as good as Shada, which is a shame because if you had a David Maloney or a Douglas Campfield directing this, and if someone goes to Louis Fiander in rehearsal and says, dude, bruh,
Don't.
no.
Yeah. Why though? Why did he? I mean, did he just think this is boring? Oh no, he gave. I think there's a quote, isn't there? It's not that. It's not that he thought it. It was that he thought it was so obvious that he was a baddie, that he was the baddie, that he wanted to make himself appear ridiculous to try and throw people off the scent. I think that's what someone has said. He said, but just no, don't.
And the rest of the acting, David Dacre as Captain Rig is terrific. He's giving two performances. He's
Yeah.
playing the serious, super professional starship captain, and then he is playing an inadvertent drug addict who is laughing in the face of. It's a very meta thing, isn't it? He's sitting there watching the Mandrels rampaging on the monitor, and he's laughing his head off, which is what most of the adults in the audience would have been doing when they saw how bad the costumes were. And then he has one scene where he's desperate and he's coming down from a high and he's desperate for more and he goes into a very dark place. It's an amazing performance, but it kind of gets lost because Louis Fiander is right next to him, sounding like Kermit the Frog in German. So it's a great performance. The actress who plays Della is not one of Doctor Who's finest performers. The actor who plays Stott is not one of Doctor Who's finest performers. So again, it's a very variable cast. Michael Craze's younger brother is pretty good, but it's a very small part. He doesn't have a lot of lines.
No, we don't get to see much of him. Yeah, and K9. Yeah, I found K9's voice particularly egregious in this. Not just his whole manner. I just that it's not my K9. It just doesn't feel like it's really him. It's just somebody trying to do a K9 voice because. Although it didn't help that I listened to the audiobook of this before rather than reading it with my actual eyes for revision for coming on, and it's well done with Dan Starkey doing the narration. He does a good he does a Tom Baker that sounds a lot like John Colshaw's Tom Baker, which John Colshaw got very famous as doing right back in the 90s on Radio 4. He made Tom Baker one of their stock characters on the Radio 4 Impressions show during the Wilderness years. And Dan Starkey's Tom Baker is basically, when somebody's doing somebody else's impression, but it works fine. But the audiobook has K9 voiced by John Leeson, which is a peculiarity.
I did not know that.
Yeah, so that's a peculiarity.
I have to ask, is it John Leeson doing David Brierley? Because David Brierley gave a very different interpretation of K9's character than John Leeson did.
Yeah, no, it's definitely just It's just K9. It's John Leeson's K9. Yeah.
I think David Brierley is very good. The first time that I heard him would have been the week before when I saw Creature from the Pit. And as an 11-year-old who is obviously super discerning and super wise, haha, I thought that he was giving the wrong interpretation of K9's character. Looking at it now and trying to be as objective as possible, I think he's very, very good. It's just that he's not. John Leeson is just, indelible with the part. He does K9 so well. The robot he's an automaton who has a personality, even though he's not supposed to have one. And David Brierley is playing a little more arrogant and a little more, world weary.
Yeah, sort of peevish.
That's the word I was. Yes, peevish. That's the word I was trying to find. Yes, exactly.
Yeah. And yes, he is trying to. Obviously, he's not just doing an impression of John Leeson. He's trying to like an actor taking on a role, doing it his own way. But because this isn't a series I often go back to all that often, I just sort of forget that it's not John Leeson, basically, and the audiobook now is isn't going to help with that. I wonder if somebody will go through it and splice all of John Leeson's readings of the lines. That would be rude. Don't do that. But I can imagine it being the sort of thing that might tickle somebody's curiosity to copy the John Leeson line readings onto, because the book the it's a fairly close following, isn't it, in the book of the dialogue at least. Um, to the show with well some changes, but I imagine it's pretty much you could get most of the lines covered.
I am curious because when they did the Five Doctors special edition in the 1990s, they re-recorded Rassilon's part to give him a deeper and more serious voice.
Yes.
If you were to go back, and obviously Louis Fiander passed away about 5 or 6 years ago, if you were to go back and have somebody else re-record Trist's lines in a regular RP accent and not sounding like Kermit the Frog, I wonder if the story would work better just with that one change alone. I'm curious. I don't think it's a bad performance. I think he's playing to the kids, and obviously Graham Crowden in the following story was just the greatest thing that I'd ever seen when I was 11 years old. It's a wonderfully winning performance. Louis Fiander is not quite there, and again, his performance doesn't fit the story at all. I'm wondering if you just re-record all of his dialogue as somebody else, does that make the story better? I don't know. I'm just curious.
No, yeah. That's the thing. Yeah, take away that silly thing, but does that make other elements of it shine, or actually will it make it a bit more sort of beige and at least it's got him being silly to yeah. I'm sure with AI options, they'll be we'll have dials that we can turn on screen to change people's accents before too long to whatever we fancy. It's horrifying as the uncanny valley of AI gets wider and wider. And,
Yeah, we're living in the era of deep fake. So I've
yeah.
already recorded my essay on the novelization, and I don't want to spoil it, and I know you haven't heard it yet. I'm going to talk quite a bit in my essay about what Terrance does to smooth over the atonality of the TV story and
Right.
what he does to make Trist a very different and much more serious villain. I want to hear from your perspective, though. What does this book do differently than the TV story, and does it work better or worse or about the same to the TV story?
I find the book, well, because you're getting an answer from me as a 49-year-old and as a oh God, what was I? A 9-year-old, sort of overlaid on top of each other. And as a kid, as a kid, this book is scary, gothic monsters and drugs and a mysterious device that things can come out of. The bugs can come out and attack you. And all of those poor people being slaughtered. It had the makings of being a horror movie. And then the TV version is there too, though. So which is full of quite a bit of clowning and people in the gold lame suits that the security guards wear. It is not going for gothic at all, which is fine. Doctor Who spent a long time being gothic, and he had to find something else to be. So I think, yeah. So I find, I think the book is scarier than the TV version, and but obviously the less, less camp. But that's not it. But that's not saying much. But also, but I want to say, yeah. No, that there's a bigger. It's not just that it's less camp. It's less. Um, I don't know. I'm struggling to say to really pin it down. But maybe it is just that the book feels like a horror story, whereas the TV version is also we haven't really talked about Tom Baker. This season, of course, is at his height of unrestrained enjoying himselfness. And there's a lot of lines probably in the script that play into that, but there's then a lot of other lines that probably are, or a fair few that are probably his additions. I haven't done a full comparison, but I guess Terrance keeps in a lot of Tom Baker things that are Tom Bakerisms. If Tom Baker does a good ad lib, I wouldn't imagine Terrance Dicks would take it out just because it was an ad lib. I imagine it would stay. But yeah, that's that main thing, that you could read the book and not be remotely aware that on TV this comes across as quite silly sometimes, and enjoys doing so. But the book doesn't really let on that quite as much. But there's still jokes, there's still humorous moments in it.
You raise a really good point about the excesses of Tom Baker. Obviously, I watched the entire series straight through between late 2020 and late 2021 at the height of the lockdown. And I would have watched all of the Tom Baker era between May and August of 2021. So I watched 7
Wow.
years of Tom Baker in 3 months. And you're watching the equivalent of 5 full years of Barry Letts and Terrance Dicks, who are the best production team Doctor Who ever had, until you get to 3 full years of Philip Hinchcliffe and Robert Holmes, who are the best production team Doctor Who ever had. You go from that to The Invisible Enemy, and the gears screeching and the way the show is falling apart around Graham Williams' inexperienced ankles.
Yeah.
It's an incredible feeling to watch 8 straight years and 5 months of Doctor Who's golden age. Everything from the War Games up through Horror of Fang Rock. There's hardly a bad story in that 8+ year run, with the possible exception of Android Invasion and some of the later Pertwee stories. You get to season 15 and the whole show falls apart. Then it makes a strong recovery for most of the Key to Time season and for much of season 17, as I've discussed. So it gets bad and then it gets better. But during the Graham Williams era, Tom Baker spends about 40% of his time fondling the TARDIS console prop. And again, there was nobody to say, dude, bruh, enough. This is not what the show is about. He wasn't doing that for Philip Hinchcliffe and Robert Holmes. He wouldn't have gotten away with it. But he's now entertaining himself, which is great. When you're a kid, it's very enjoyable. But you have this infamous scene in part 4 where he goes into the projection and the Mandrels are attacking him off screen. And he is just. I'm not going to play the audio because this is a serious show and my audience deserves better. It's one of his most ridiculous moments. And if you listen to the Nightmare of Eden episode of the sister podcast to this show, Tony Witt's The Doctor Who Target Book Club podcast, they play that clip and they're very critical of Tom Baker, and they're right to do so. But in the very next scene after that, what happens? Trist is being led away by the cops, and he runs to the Doctor and he wants the Doctor to forgive him. And Tom Baker plays that moment. It's one of his best bits of acting in 7 years. And it follows just seconds after some of the most ridiculous, unconscionable acting he's ever done. So that's Tom Baker in a nutshell. In that 60-second bit, you have the best of Tom Baker and the worst of Tom Baker in the same scene. It's fascinating.
It was the best of Tom. It was the worst of Tom. Yeah.
And then I challenge you to read the corresponding passage in the novelization. And I'm going to read it in my essay, so I'm not going to read it right now. Terrance makes it work in a way that Alan Bromley and then Graham Williams directing for Alan Bromley The Last Day does not make it work. So Terrance fixes it.
There are some. He does the opening sequence of the spaceships comes on TV. On TV, there's a very strange absence of sound effect. There's just Dudley Simpson going for it, and the spaceship's flying along, and then you see the collision, but there isn't a sound to accompany the collision, which I always think is really strange because it makes it feel like you're just looking at an effect. But I love Terrance's prose in that, just on the first few pages of really selling the scale and the drama of all that to you in a way that they just, I mean, even on a good day, that was a tough call for the BBC visual effects to manage, even if there wasn't an inflation crisis going on. So that opening sequence in particular is just spectacularly well written and really draws you into this big epic event. But the book is only 111 pages, and that's including all the front bits. Does that make it one of his shortest?
Yeah, so 1979, he did very short books: Robots of Death, Invisible Enemy, Destiny of the Daleks. Then he was going back to 125 pages, and this one drops down, and it's very, very short indeed, which is atypical for him, at this point in his career.
Yeah, but it doesn't feel like he's skimping at all.
I will point out in my audio essay, if you look at the page count, most of the book is part 1. And that means he doesn't have as much space for part 4. So there's several deleted
Interesting.
scenes that
Right.
he doesn't transcribe from television. He drops them entirely because the doctor's not in them. And then part 4 does seem noticeably rushed. The thing is, because of the way he writes an action scene, you don't really notice that it's rushed because you're turning the pages compulsively. That's how good a writer he is for the big climaxes.
Yeah. It's a pacey book, and I really enjoyed the audio. The audio it's one of those ones where they've included quite a lot of effects. Sometimes maybe a little bit over the top, but so when he's reading about the passengers being massacred, you've got screams and alarms and growling and going on. But there's maybe a little bit over the top sometimes, but it adds to it. It makes it more than a plain reading. They've zhuzhed it up a little bit too.
So speaking of screams and alarms, I want to segue to our game of the week with you.
Oh,
And
yes.
I'm going to challenge you to a game that you have not played on this show before, but Jim and
No.
I played it last week. I'm going to challenge you to guess that cliffhanger.
Okay.
Now, you've heard the show, you know the rules. I'm going to show you 3 cliffhangers. You have to name both the story and the episode part. So some of the stories are very obvious, but it's hard because you have to guess which episode it is. And this is, of course, all classic series. Are you ready?
I'm nervously ready. I'm not expecting. Yeah, I'm up for it. I'll give it a go. Let's see.
All right, here is your first clue.
Doctor, can you hear me?
Sarah, what are you doing here?
Rescuing you, actually. For a change.
Now that is your first clue. What do you make of that?
Oh, that's. I can imagine myself inserting that into about half a dozen stories. Is it the android invasion?
Yes, it is, because we discussed Android Invasion earlier in this show, and the fact that it came up as guess that cliffhanger was totally coincidental. But yes, it is Android Invasion.
It was that eye. I remember the eye.
There's 3 cliffhangers. Which cliffhanger is it?
Oh god, yeah, that's point. I've got to know it now. I don't think it's. Oh no, because one is which one's the robot face on the Sarah dummy? That's one, isn't it? So I'm going to say 2.
Oh, you're very, very close, but you have them transposed. The android face is part 2. Stigler's face is part 1.
Oh right. Okay. There we go. Okay.
So I'm going to give you 1 point. And now, so passing is 4. You only need to get 3 more points out of the next 2 questions, the story right and the episode number right. So you're close to passing. Not off to a bad start. And let me play you your second clip.
Do you ever wonder why I'm doing these things? Hiding in shadows, fighting in corners?
We took it for granted you belong to the other side, the aristocracy.
No. No. I have no title or position. I belong, well, in the middle. But I hate to see order thrown out of the window like so much dust. There can be no loyalty or honor where anarchy prevails.
Leon was your friend.
There are only 2 sides today, Barbara. Those who rule by fear and treachery, and those who fight for reason, justice. Anyone who betrays these principles is worse than the devil in hell.
Here they are.
Lamette.
Your friend has betrayed us.
All right, now that is a tough one. If I were on the other side and you were showing me the clip, I'm not positive that I would get the episode right, but give it a go. It's black and white, obviously.
It's not Edge of Destruction. It's not Carnival. It's not the Cave Monster. It's not the Tribe of Gum is what I was reaching for. There's a phrase I haven't used for a long time. Okay, that's sounding proper actors. That's sounding historical. So and I'm going to infer that it's Reign of Terror.
Very good. You are correct. That is your second point
Good.
because it's Ian and Barbara and William
Yeah.
Hartnell, and there's no sci-fi elements, and it's obviously not Marco Polo or the Tribe of Gum.
Hmm. But which part? Oh, now it's the Doctor's in. No, if I knew better, if I paid more attention or remembered my facts better, I'd remember which episode that the Doctor isn't in. So it can't be that one. Oh no, it's not. It's Ian. There's an episode that Ian's not in, so it can't be that one. But I can't remember which one that is. So knowing that fact is of absolutely no benefit to me in trying to pin this down. Didn't sound like a climactic episode 5, but I'm really fishing around here. So I'm going to go. I'm going to say episode 3. That's a guess.
Well, I'll give you a clue. Reign of Terror is a 6-part story, and the character Lemaitre is often mentioned but never seen until the end. So it is a surprise twist as to who the character is. Do you want to revise your guess? As to
I
which
think I
episode it
do.
is?
I think maybe that's episode 5 then.
Yes, it is. Episode 5,
Hey.
A Bargain of Necessity. All right, so you've got 3 out of 4 possible points. You only need 1 more to win. So I will now play you your final clip.
There it is again, Jimmy. Can you hear it? Hey, what is it? Your guess is as good as mine. There's something inside there. Doctor! Victoria, come on!
That is one of my favorite Troughton era stories. We've obviously seen Troughton, so not a spoiler that it's a Troughton story. But which one is it, and which episode part?
It's got to be Fury from the Deep.
Absolutely. And that's one of the stories where the cliffhangers are all kind of samey, so you've got to narrow it
Yeah.
down. And I'll tell you, that's your 4th point. You have passed.
Oh, okay.
For the bonus, to get 5 out of
Right.
6, you have to name which episode that is without cheating.
Okay. It can't. My previous deductive powers haven't been that good when it comes to pinning down an episode, but I don't think it's episode 1 because that sounds too. I think they hold off quite a while. So I've said episode 3 previously. I'm going to say episode 3 again. Is it episode 3?
It is not. It is, in fact, episode 1. You were right there.
Oh, it is episode 1. I think so. I'm really good at coming up with a reason for not picking the correct answer.
Again, it's
I
tough.
had it in my head that they hung around a bit longer than that before going into it to that extent, and that it was more, the menace didn't really hit them until later on, but clearly not. Yeah.
It's tough because, again...
I want to give that a rewatch. Isn't it great that we can just put that in and watch it now?
Oh, the animated version. Yeah, the Gary Russell directed animated version in color is just gorgeous. It's a good story, but the cliffhanger, I can never remember where the cliffhangers are because I haven't watched it often enough to have them memorized. The cliffhangers
same. Yeah.
The episode 2 cliffhanger, which does not have the Doctor or Jamie and Victoria in it, is incredible. It's very menacing, and it doesn't have... It's entirely guest characters talking, but it's a great cliffhanger for that. This is a little more traditional, Victoria screaming, but yes, it is in fact episode 1.
I do love and this is one of the best TARDIS team in peril cliffhangers. But I do love the ones that are a plot revelation. That make everything suddenly take on a new dimension for next week. That's a really clever. That's also a really good genre of cliffhanger.
Victor Pemberton really brought Doctor Who's script writing to a whole new level because he was interested in characters and emotions more than he was in monsters and peril. So the scene that he wrote for Tomb of the Cybermen, which is the Doctor and Victoria talking about their families, is one of obviously the show's most famous scenes. He put a similar moment in Abominable Snowmen, and this was a story that he wrote entirely himself, and it's all about the emotions of the characters, especially Victoria. And Victoria and Jamie have a very adult relationship together in this story. I think it's marvelous, and the fact that it's entirely missing meant that it was unappreciated for all those years. And now that we have the animated version, I think we can get back to marveling at how good this story is. We know from the censor clips how scary it was, especially considering when it was made.
Yeah.
But definitely think Fury from the Deep does not get enough praise for being one of the best, especially of the Troughton era.
Yeah, and it's one of those great things of fairly unusual things, of a companion getting a leaving story, rather than more of a, oh, it's the last 5 minutes, actually I'm off, which a lot of them unfortunately end up getting because of the turnaround. But it feels like the whole story does, just Victoria leaving at the end of it feels entirely natural. I mean, I guess it was it was very shocking if you were watching it as a kid, but when you look at it now, that it's seeded, and she has had enough of being utterly traumatized week in, week out, and you can't blame her. It's not an abrupt one.
And considering that the three companion departures before Victoria were Dodo and Ben and Polly.
Yeah, the worst. Yeah, well, them and Vicky all had the worst, didn't they? Yeah. Yeah. Turn page and apparently I'm leaving now, Doctor. Goodbye.
Poor Maureen O'Brien. They didn't bother. She had gone on vacation for a month, not aware that she was being fired, and then she gets to the script. Wait a minute, what just happened?
Yeah,
I could have been looking for work.
Unbelievable. Yeah. But she certainly is one of the ones who's had the most flourishing range of careers, really, in plural, isn't it? Because she's an author, she's an agent, and she's very in demand. She's got lots of Radio 4 drama credits and Radio 4 dramas throughout all through the 80s, and I think she cropped up a lot around there in the 90s.
And I've been watching the Matthew Sweet interview with her on the Series 2 Blu-ray collection, which is, again, amazing. I love Season 2, and she's all over it. And again, Vicky is about as unappreciated as Fury from the Deep is. There's so much to appreciate there.
And they're both, and the thing that I think I would say they've got in common, they're both just really archetypal Doctor Who elements. Like his Fury from the Deep could easily be called the best, the definitive base under siege, and Maureen O'Brien sort of invents the definitive plucky sidekick young girl who's very scared, who can be very scared, but is very, very brave, as we went on and just became the archetype. And maybe when fans are looking for things to talk about, we tend to talk about things that are a little bit to one side of that because that gives us stuff to compare and contrast with. But when you're looking for something that's just a perfectly formed example of a central thing for Doctor Who, they're both that, really, aren't they? Yeah.
Yeah, she is the template for Joe Grant and Romana too. It's all there.
Yeah. And the ways she looked after William Hartnell as well.
Yeah, they were a great combination together. Yeah, I've taken up a lot of your time today. So just in wrapping up, where else can we find you online?
Do say I'm on Twitter. Do say hello. I'm prof_quite a mess on Twitter, and I do tend to be cropping up on podcasts here, there, and everywhere these days. I just like talking about Doctor Who and tangentially related things.
This is your 4th appearance on this show, and hopefully not your last.
So thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me on. It's been really fun.
Doctor Who and the Nightmare of Eden, written by Terrance Dicks, televised as Nightmare of Eden, teleplay by Bob Baker, televised in November and December 1979, published in 1980. Cover artist, Andrew Skilleter. A freak accident locks two ships together in space, and a distress call brings the Doctor, Romana, and the faithful K9 onto the scene. The Doctor's efforts to separate the two ships involve him with treacherous drug smugglers, ferocious monsters, and a savagely dangerous planet called Eden. As I get older, I forget for many Doctor Who stories which came first for me, the episode or the novelization. I know the first novelization that I bought after I'd already seen the TV story was The Ark in Space, for example. And I know that I bought some novelizations because I wanted to clear up something I'd seen or heard on TV first, like the British pronunciation of the word laboratory in The Brain of Morbius. And I know that I read Nightmare of Eden as a book first. Why? Because of The Cliffhanger. My friend Stephen, who got me into Doctor Who, and who then stopped watching and reading the show long, long ago, used to read his novelizations one episode per day. One day on the walk home from 7th grade, he announced that he was going home to read Rider from Shang 2, episode 5 of Marco Polo. Of course, we didn't know where the cliffhangers were. My usual trick for a book was to divide the page count by the number of episodes. This led to some funny errors. Like for years, I labored under the delusion that The Enemy of the World was a 5-part story. This mathematical assumption on my part was logical, but the reality is that most books explode that assumption, especially when you're talking about Malcolm Hulke, who would often have the Part 1 material take up a full third of the text. Now, if you divide Nightmare of Eden, the book's 105 pages versus Nightmare of Eden's 4 parts on TV, then it's safe to assume that Part 1 falls at about page 32, or perhaps the first chapter ending after page 32, which here is the end of chapter 3, on page 34. It is a great, great moment. Quote, "A shuffling movement in the shadows made the Doctor realize that the one he was seeking could be right behind him. The Doctor spun round and saw a glimpse of a goggled, space-coveralled figure holding a blaster. The Doctor backed away, talking frantically to gain time. 'Hello. Now please don't do anything hasty. I'm sure we can talk this over.' The Doctor was planning to hurl himself aside, but he left it too late. The blaster fired, catching him full in its energy beam. The Doctor writhed, staggered, then pitched headlong onto the floor. Stooping over the Doctor's huddled body, the shadowy figure searched quickly through his pockets, found and took the remaining vial of Vraxoin, and hurried from the room." So, when I finally got to see Nightmare of Eden on TV, and this was probably mid to late August of 1985, after we got back from our family trip to Spain, see episode 50 for that story, and by the way, that trip to Spain cost me my first look at City of Death. I was shocked then to see that this moment is rather cursorily shot on TV, and comes only midway through Part 1. No, the Part 1 cliffhanger, in the book, waits all the way until page 41, end of chapter 4. That means that 35 of 105 pages in the book, exactly 1/3 of the text, covers just 1/4 of the TV story. And that means a lot less text for the concluding installments. This structure is further proof, as if any were needed, that Terrance Dicks is a genius. Nightmare of Eden is a strange story to watch on TV. It's all over the place tonally, with a lot of Douglas Adams humor grafted onto the Bob Baker script, the two officious customs agents, for example, masking a very serious plot, drug addiction, on Saturday tea time, and then Tom Baker finally going off the rails at the worst of his season 17 excesses, causing director Alan Bromley to be fired by producer Graham Williams towards the end of production. And the whole affair looks a little cheap. Okay, looks very cheap, attributed to the ongoing recession of the late 70s. Although Baker's script cleverly acknowledges that by talking about how the, quote, galactic recession has impacted Professor Trist's funding. The novelization dispenses with all that atonality from television, all that cheapness. Gone is Louis Fiander's goofy accent and intentionally tangled syntax. Gone are the bizarre 1979 leather fetish village people biker look, the pancake makeup, and the monsters in bell-bottom trousers, or flares as I believe they're called across the pond. All that's left are the camera scripts, the story everyone thought they were getting before the studio sessions began, before everything fell apart. Now, Terrance Dicks puts this out in 1980, a year when he wrote 10 books, but he doesn't seem to have got the memo that this is supposed to be a disposable nothing, jammed in between his novelizations of the Armageddon Factor and the Horns of Nimon. Instead, he turns Part 1 into a proper big-budget Irwin Allen disaster epic. Yes, he probably had an idea that Professor Trist, the story's Charles Darwin as drug smuggler villain, was supposed to have a respectable Germanic accent, but he doesn't write any overacting, doesn't paint the word picture of any ridiculous costume. In short, he treats the thing with the respect you'd never know it deserved. Half the first page is taken up by describing why the collision between the Hecate and the Empress happens. Now Conrad and Fraser are off this week, so you'll have to bear with my reading. I'll try to do it justice. Page 7. It should have been impossible, but it happened. So enormous are the distances between the stars that even at light speed, journeys of hundreds, even thousands of years are necessary to cross them. Only the invention of warp drive made interstellar travel a practical possibility. Warp drive enables spaceships to leave normal space and enter hyperspace, traveling colossal distances in a flash. Once man discovered warp drive, his spaceship spread out over his own galaxy in a wave, and even began exploring the galaxies beyond. In time, interstellar travel became routine, but there were still dangers. One of them was warp smash. A ship tries to leave hyperspace at exactly the same point occupied by another. Two sets of atoms and molecules try to fill the same position in space and time. The result? Instant, mutual annihilation. However, there were exceptions, freak accidents in which the impossible happened. This was to be one of them. The tragic figure at the center of Nightmare of Eden is Captain Rigg, who starts off as a super competent Starship liner captain, and Terrance makes us root for this guy right from the beginning, page 8. He's worried, when we first meet him, quote, a tough, balding veteran, near the age limit for a space pilot. Or on page 9, quote, like most spacemen, like pilots before them, and like sailors before them, Rigg was deeply superstitious. Boom. Here's your audience identification figure, before the Doctor and Romana and K9 show up. Terrance's text hews closely to what we got on TV, with some slightly altered dialogue. Here in Chapter 1, the Doctor immediately realizes that Dimmond is the captain of the smaller crashed ship, which he doesn't on TV. This is our second book for the Lalla Ward Romana, but Terrance gives her some of the same attributes that he gave the Mary Tam version of the character in our recently completed Key to Time miniseason, episodes 55 to 58 of this program. Page 17. Although she didn't show it, Romana was quietly furious at being left behind. Presumably the Doctor was just trying to keep her out of danger, or perhaps he wanted all the credit of being a miracle worker for himself. There was a broad streak of childish vanity in the Doctor's character, decided Romana. Terrance's observational powers are full to the fore in Chapter 2, as he describes the Empress's storage areas, corridors, and luxury lounges, and Sekker's Vraxoan-induced drug high. And I love this description of Trist on page 21, through Romana's eyes. Quote, the old-fashioned square-lensed glasses, the fussy manner, and the clipped, slightly Germanic speech all suggested the academic, while the lean body and the deeply tanned skin were those of a man used to outdoor life. In fact, you could deduce what Trist was, just by looking at him, decided Romana. He could only be some kind of archaeologist or zoologist, a scholar who spent most of his life outdoors, on strange and dangerous planets. The Doctor's first interview with Trist, in Chapter 3, is civil and urbane in Terrance's hands. Not comical, like this excerpt from the television.
Really? Then where did you go?
We went through the Cygnus Gap.
What?
Yeah, and then we did a slingshot over to a small system, just 3 planets, M37, you know? The second planet supports life in a very early stage of evolution. The mollusks, the algae, the primitive insects. I can show you.
No, that's perfectly all right. I'm just interested in the voids. Fascinating.
Here you are. A copy of my log. I published it to go in my lectures.
The Volanti.
Yes, the name of my ship.
And you invented this marvelous machine to collect your specimens? You know, I knew a man once who toyed with an idea like this. What was his name? A professor? Professor Stein?
Professor Stein?
Yes.
Oh, a dear friend. He was my mentor. We worked on this idea together before he died, of course. Then we stopped.
In the book, Trist apologizes to Della after complaining to the Doctor about not having stimulating people to talk to on his own ship. There is no such apology on TV. That sounds like a Terrance fix. Terrance also adds an unusual level of graphic detail to the description of the failed attempts to save Sekker's life in the operating room. Page 35, for example, there was an anteroom to the Empress's sickbay, a small, comfortably furnished area with a window giving onto the operating theater itself. Rigg was gazing through that window now, watching a team of medics working on Sekker's unconscious body, cleaning and sealing the terrible wounds, giving an emergency blood transfusion, using everything that medical skills and up-to-date equipment could provide to preserve the weakly flickering life. Something about the desperate urgency of their movements told Rigg that it wasn't going to be enough. Also in the book, the chief medic gets a couple of lines of dialogue explaining why Sekker died. On TV, especially in this cash-strapped era, you wouldn't pay an actor just to deliver a single line of dialogue. So the message of Sekker's death is staged by director Alan Bromley as just a curt shake of the head. Chapter 5 is titled Drugged. This got to me as a kid. The tragedy of Captain Rigg, who right up until his inadvertent drugging is a worthy, sharp-tongued ally of the Doctor. On page 44, the Doctor even realizes that it might be helpful for Rigg to think that he's a narc. Oh, and also in this chapter, the mandrills have, quote, rows of drooling fangs in their mouths, a detail we were spared on TV, where the mandrills are just the cutest, most adorable things. Speaking of cute, this chapter also explains about the winged insect, or, on TV, the poorly drawn blob of light that stung Romana into unconsciousness. The chapter ends with the realization that Rigg has been drugged. Come to think of it, I felt awful for poor Rigg after reading the book the first time, but David Dacre's terrific two-sided performance on TV is equally remarkable.
Little ships in big ships. Ships in bottles. Russian dolls, that's what it's like. You remember those?
Yes, I do. I wonder if the people who made them realized they were making a model of the universe.
What? Eh?
As a primitive concept, you know.
I don't think the captain is in the mood to discuss philosophy. Can I get you anything, Rigg? A caffeine capsule, perhaps?
No. Let's talk about life. While I await my dismissal and eventual execution for dereliction of duty, and I couldn't care less.
Oh, come on, Captain. The doctor may still come up with something.
Doctor? The enigmatic, almighty Mr. Fix-It. He's failed again, and I don't care about that either.
With a little time to spend on parts 2, 3, and 4, chapters start to go by with giddy speed. Chapter 7 takes up just 3 TV scenes. Fisk and Costa, the Douglas Adams-esque local customs agents, are barely described, other than as 2 grim-faced black uniformed figures, one of whom is, quote, obviously the more senior of the 2. That's the only characterization we get, other than their stilted officious dialogue. The chapter also omits a lengthy dialogue passage on TV between Trist and Della, where Trist begins the process of throwing suspicion onto Della so she can take the blame for his drug smuggling operation. That scene may have been a late bit of padding to fill out the running time. At any rate, you won't miss it when reading the book. But there is added dialogue, the Doctor defending Rigg against accusations of drunkenness by praising the man's professionalism. That's in the book, but not in the corresponding scene on TV. The choices of material that Terrance adapts or doesn't adapt shows that he's putting the emphasis on the human tragedy in the story, rather than the comedy of manners about funny accents and one-note bureaucrats. On TV, the planet Eden was a studio-bound jungle set, not a particularly large one. Terrance works his best magic to make the planet look and feel real. You are there, in the first paragraph of Chapter 8, page 65. The Doctor and Romana plunged headlong into the jungle. By the time they stopped for breath, they were surrounded by dense foliage. Broad-leaved plants and long trailing vines struggled for space between mighty trees, whose leaves formed an oppressive canopy overhead. Between the treetops, there was an occasional glimpse of Eden's lurid orange sky. The ground underfoot was damp and soggy, the air warm and humid, filled with the cries of night birds and shrill chirping of insects. The rest of the chapter shows Terrance's storytelling powers. He deletes 2 scenes set in the Empress's VIP lounge, scenes with Costa, Fisk, Trist, and Dimmond trying to find the Doctor and Romana. Instead, Chapter 8 goes straight through, following only the Doctor and Romana, and their later scenes with Stott and then K9. Only the last half page of the chapter features other characters, 2 minor speaking roles who are promptly killed by mandrels. Terrance also, wisely for a book in 1980 predominantly read by kids, deletes Stott's grim, dark TV line about having wanted to blow his brains out. That's a powerful line, but it's lost in the middle of a campy TV story full of goofy performances. The book, much more serious than TV, is better off for missing that line, but the chapter does benefit from a more detailed explanation than we got on TV of how Secker became part of Trist's and Dimmond's conspiracy. In the book, it's postulated that Secker was bribed and then intentionally drugged to aid the smuggling ring. On TV, his guilt is suggested, but in the book, he's made even more of a tragic victim than he was in the Part 1 material. While Terrance never forgets that the Doctor is the star of the show, and that the companion also needs to have interesting POV insights, he also likes to dip in and out of his villains' heads once in a while. Chapter 9, page 77. After Fisk and Costa go blustering around, complaining and threatening for the better part of Episode 3, Terrance allows our secret bad guy, Trist, to set the scene. Quote, Professor Trist looked worriedly at Fisk. It looked very much as if the Empress's new commander was already cracking up under the strain. Of course, Terrance still has time to have fun at the expense of Fisk's lack of logic. He's constantly drawing our attention to things that don't make sense, like broken watches, keeping perfect time, or any of Fisk's thought processes. Page 81. Luckily, Stott's watch was still undamaged, and even more amazingly, it was still working. I guess the director missed that little bit of plot contrivance before he got fired. Page 85. I don't know what you're up to, but I intend to prevent you anyway, said Fisk with a fine lack of logic. End quote. Fisk has a lot more dialogue in this chapter too, about how he intends to frame and or kill the Doctor and Romana, even if he's not totally convinced that they're the real drug smugglers. The end of Chapter 10, pages 86 and 87, the build-up to the Part 3 cliffhanger, is told at a breakneck pace, with 8 separate single-sentence sections in quick succession. You fly through these 2 pages compulsively. A lot of Target books play around with TV cliffhangers, dropping them entirely, or setting them in mid-paragraph or even in mid-sentence, but not Part 3 of Nightmare of Eden, that's for sure. Captain Rigg dies in Chapter 10. I guess I'm still sad about the fate of this fictional character, even if he does try to assault Romana in his final scene. Terrance adds a quick fix for another bit of plot illogic, how Rigg is escorted off the bridge under armed guard on page 76, but then winds up back on the bridge alone on page 83. Terrance explains how that happens with a bit of dialogue that wasn't on television. Part 4 is very condensed and rushed, since there's only 24 pages left of space to devote to it. At least there's more welcome comedy at Fisk's expense in Chapter 11. Quote, the idea of Dimmond being free to go about his business was quite unacceptable to Fisk's bureaucratic mind, and Fisk was, quote, glad to have someone he could safely bully. One difference, though, is in the book, Fisk threatens to order the Coast Guard battlecruisers to shoot Dimmond down, should he try to leave the Empress. The TV line is much better, so I suspect it was a late change in rehearsal, and the line has a very Douglas Adams feel to it, bearing in mind that Douglas Adams once wrote the video game Bureaucracy, where the player's score is measured in blood pressure readings. Fisk says on TV, quote, "I'll nail a writ to your bulkhead," and that's by far a better line. Della's line on TV about seeing ghosts in the Eden projection is also not in the book. There's a key change on page 95. In the book, Trist gives a measured, rational explanation, while trying to hoodwink Fisk into believing that the Doctor is the mastermind Vraxoan smuggler. Trist says via Terrance, once the accident had occurred, it provided a useful cover, an ideal way to divert suspicion. After all, the Doctor is a particularly cunning criminal. That's a good line, and underlines Trist's devious villainy. On TV, Louis Fiander and the production team instead opt for comedy.
I can only imagine that one of the crew of my expedition found a new source of this, what is this thing called?
Vrax.
Ah, Vrax.
Vrax.
Yes, Vrax. And placed it in the transmute location. Yes. Then he informed the doctor. So, the doctor comes on board and makes the pickup, which fits in with your own wonderful theory, does it not?
Yes. Only... why did he bother to separate the ships?
Perhaps it's because, as you say, he is a criminal.
Yes, that would be it.
If you're wondering, by the way, what is an Enchuca laser, the seemingly nonsensical phrase which is mentioned on TV several times in Part 4, the book calls it an encoder laser instead, E-N-C-O-D-E-R. When I first saw this on TV, after having read the book first, remember, I was confused why so many actors seemed to be having trouble pronouncing the word encoder. It's not like they were trying to say Armageddon, after all. There are other slight dialogue changes between TV and Chapter 12. In the book, Trist urges Dimon to kill a charging mandrill. The TV line is better, and forgive me for not doing the accent. No, don't kill him. He's valuable. In Chapter 13, Della is shot in the shoulder. Now on TV, she was shot in the neck, basically, but crumples to the floor clutching her stomach. I'm with Terrance on this one. The shoulder, not the neck, certainly not the stomach. The business with Tom Baker getting mauled off-screen by the mandrills and shouting out a list of injured body parts. No, I'm not going to play the audio. This is a serious show, gosh darn it. Is also not in the book. Quote, the Doctor shot out of the jungle and came hurtling out of the projection, is what Terrance gives us instead. On page 108, Terrance gives us a more detailed explanation of what the expression hoist on his own petard means. It's 4 pages from the end of the book, and time to wrap up, but Terrance never passes up an opportunity to teach something new for the kids. The TV episode takes some more wild swings in tone in the closing minutes. After Baker's goofy performance in the jungle, he then icily dismisses Trist with a stern "go away." But then a minute later, there's a canine belongs in an electronic zoo joke. Terrance closes the book more seriously. Trist, he writes on page 110, was the worst kind of criminal after all, reflected the Doctor, the kind who sincerely believes that however appalling his crimes, there is always a perfectly valid excuse. There's also an explanation in the book that Eden will be quarantined to preserve the secret that the mandrills are the source of Vraxoan. This is a fast book, only 105 pages of text. But in terms of mood and theme, Terrance gets it exactly right, and this book is, unlike the TV production, no nightmare. Next time on Doctor Who Literature, we jump ahead 2 more months to October 1980. In America, Ronald Reagan debated Jimmy Carter in the run-up to the 1980 presidential election. Tug McGraw and the Philadelphia Phillies easily handled the Kansas City Royals to win their first ever World Series title after nearly a century of existence as a baseball team. On TV screens, Meglos was the current Doctor Who episode, and in the book line comes a very maligned TV story from just the year before. This story I love to pieces, and I think so too does my guest next week. We're going to undertake the great journey of life and praise him, as together we read Doctor Who and the Horns of Nymon. Lord Nymon, it is I, Doctor Who Literature, next week. Thank you for joining me on another episode of the Doctor Who Literature podcast. Special thanks to my special guest, Pete Lambert. This podcast can be found on most of your podcast apps of choice. You can find all past episodes at anchor.fm/DoctorWhoLit. It really helps if you rate 5 stars and subscribe. You can find me on Twitter at Doctor Who Novels, that's DrWho Novels. My old tweets about the entire series under the hashtag Doctor Who Pilgrimage, that's DrWho Pilgrimage. My current Twilight Zone watch-through under hashtag TZ Pilgrimage. And on email at Doctor Who Literature, that's DrWho Literature, at gmail.com. Please drop me a line with your comments, questions, and suggestions. Thank you for listening, and whatever you do, keep turning the pages.
A Doctor Who podcast network.